All right, so yesterday we were talking about what were we talking about? Definition of transpersonal. Okay, at the end we found that the definition of transpersonal, according to Jung in Collective Work 7, which is the only time he references the term, is synonymous with the collective unconscious. So the question is whether or not the collective unconscious is an outdated idea. And there are reasons to believe that it is. The first reason is that it's vague and ambiguous. So it's vague because it's not clear what it's pointing at, and it's ambiguous because it's possible, I think, that the unconscious could also refer to something that is conscious. And so when you say the collective unconscious, you're both referring to something that I don't know what you're saying, and you're referring to something that I think is also conscious. And so this would be a case, if this were true, of Jung playing sort of, I mean, we talked about it yesterday as cultural critic, but today I would refer to it as something more like obscurantist, which is what you typically get in a criticism of somebody you don't understand. So, for example, you'll often hear people talking about Derrida as obscurantist, and that's what I'm doing here. It may be because I don't actually know what he's saying, but it may be because I think that he's missing something, or that he found himself in a place where he felt the need to obscure the thing that he was trying to describe. So let me take that position today and say that I think that Jung, in referring to the collective unconscious and the transpersonal, was referring to something that could be and often is, and I think perhaps, I'm not sure I would say is of necessity conscious, but is at least amenable to consciousness, and let me try to say something about what I think that is. All right. So I'm looking at the paper that I'm going to give to the Emerson and James talk, and I mean, I don't really know where to go with this, and I'm not really sure what else to say about Emerson and James. Emerson, the literature on Emerson is sort of, I don't know if it's reached an impasse or what, but I can't find anything that new about it. And the same is true with James. You can't really find that much new about it. Rorty gave his talk on it, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, and I'm not really sure who else is doing anything with it. So what we're starting to see in this connection is this gradual disinterest in the things that the Americans were talking about. And so when I say the Americans, I think we can say this in distinction with the Swiss and the German. So I guess I read a paper today that was interesting about, it was from like the early 1900s, I think, about Emerson and Kant. And it's like, yeah, I know. Like, obviously Kant is going to come up in Emerson, but who cares if the whole point was like, did Emerson read Kant? And if so, did he read him properly? And it's like, who cares? Who cares? I mean, Kant has something interesting to say vis-a-vis like Orthodox Christianity. If you listen to some of the Orthodox Christianity on YouTube, you'll find that they are likely unfamiliar with Kant, which is surprising given some of their background. You would think that Protestantism would teach Kant as sort of the philosophical bulwark against the gradual degradation of their theological position, but apparently they don't. Okay, so does it matter? Does Kant matter for Emerson? The answer is no. I think Emerson is doing something. I guess here's the point about Emerson, is it's ephemeral. Emerson died out. Whatever his project was is no longer. You have some of the Unitarian churches doing whatever it is that they're doing, and I think there's probably always going to be these enclaves of religious commitment. But I suppose the question for, what do they call it now? Global society is, what is the nature of religion? And I think in a lot of ways, we all want to have religious commitments that allow us to take other people seriously, is maybe an easy way to put it. So the idea is that Emerson is dead, James is dead. Who came after that? Jung was this sort of like weirdo guy in the corner that nobody's really ever going to care much about, except for to the extent that it has implications for the therapeutic process, which is a profession and a vocation. It's not a metaphysical commitment, it's a practical one. And so I wonder if that's part of what Emerson was doing, but I don't think that's all of what he was doing. I think he really wanted to set up, you would think most people try to set up a metaphysical system that is going to outlive them. And maybe, with the turn away from metaphysics, with Heidegger and all of these things in the early 20th century, maybe the idea is that we actually don't want to set up metaphysical systems. So maybe metaphysical systems were important in earlier stages of humanity, because it was the means by which you transmit your pragmatic, ways of being. It's a way of codifying perhaps the way that you live. And so if you think you have some kind of novel moral contribution, you would codify it in a metaphysical system, and then it would take people a really long time to untangle your metaphysical system to the point where they're engaging with it for a sufficient amount of time that you've at least done something. And that's what I think people do. That's what Jung was doing. He spun his web, and it's complicated, and you're always trying to figure out why he's wrong or why you're wrong, and that's fun to do. And it also has, I think, Jung's major contribution was the Christification of psychology. I mean, there's no, I don't say that with any moral or normative commitment. I think that the history of religion shows that these things are kind of co-occurring, and you react to one another. And I mean, one example might be, I don't want to get too much into this because this is a sort of sectarianism that I'm not really part of. But you have, what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of the debates with, what's the guy's name? Pico de Gallo? No, what's his name? The Italian guy, whatever. The Hermeticism and the relationship between Hermeticism and Kabbalah in like the 14, 15, 16, 1700s in Italy with, I'm not going to be able to figure out what I'm thinking of, but whatever. All I'm trying to say is that these religious systems are always in conversation with one another. If you think of Zoroastrianism and Manichaeanism and Judaism and Christianity and all of the reactions to one another in their formation and in their development. Okay, and so what I want to say about Jung is he's trying to bring in the Christian point of view, whatever that might be, into dream work. I think that's probably the simplest way to put it. And he does that through the myth. And you see that with Freud doing that with the myth too. I mean, I don't think this is unique to Jung. I think the idea is just that Jung is trying to bring into... I mean, what is the fundamental insight of Christianity? Anyone have any ideas? I think it's amoralism, is I think what it is. If you look at Nietzsche, who was a Christian, and I can defend that textually, although I'm probably wrong. I also try to defend textually the idea that the return of Christ was Pentecost, which I think you can do, kind of, but it's not quite in the sources in the way that I thought it was. So I'm happy to be wrong about that, although I would be interested if anybody... I mean, it seems pretty... Logically, it makes sense, right? Logically, it makes sense. That Pentecost is the return of Christ. All right. Okay. So what is Jung trying to do vis-a-vis psychology? He's trying to bring into it amoralism, and he does that by way of Nietzsche, who was a Christian. And Nietzsche was a Christian for reasons that I don't know that I could get into kind of off the cuff. But if you read it, he's a Christian. What he doesn't like is Christians. And he's not a Christian. There's only one Christian, it was Christ. But he is sort of in the tradition of Christian amoralism. And that's why that's the reason I bring him up, is because of Beyond Good and Evil, Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, and all of the things that he wrote about sort of, good is bad and bad is good. Whatever. He started with Schopenhauer and Schopenhauer's engagement with the Eastern traditions, which have the same kind of idea, but I don't know that I can speak on it really because I'm not sure if it's true. But my sense is that to the extent that I've started to see this in Jung, in the East, you have this apersonalism where, I don't know if this development is right. If anybody has any idea about this, it would be interesting. But the idea seems to be there was this animism in the East, Shinto, whatever, I don't know if I'm even saying that right, and all of the sort of animalistic folk religions that developed gradually into this Buddhism that came out of probably India. I don't know exactly. But then there's the idea is that this is my idea, probably other people have had it. In the East, you have an amoral and an apersonal metaphysics, where because the ultimate reality is not a person, ultimate reality is not moral, and so you get this closer connection with nature, and what you see Jung bringing that in. In the West, you have your metaphysic based on the worship of a person and personality as such. I mean, I would be interested to know more about, I think, some of the stuff in the East that tends to suggest that, consciousness is a natural product, and that would be very interesting because I think consciousness is a fifth dimension in all of this. But in the West, you have the fundamental reality being a person, and because the fundamental reality is a person, and a person is typically limited, this is an interpretation, the person is typically limited, then there's this normative system that has to come with the worship of a person. The worship of a person always has norms because it's finite, and you always have to have norms if you're dealing in finitude. Okay, so Nietzsche, in this tradition of the person, and you see in Nietzsche, for example, the idea of, what's his guy? Zarathustra. So Zarathustra is Christ, whatever. Jung has the same thing. Jung has, what's his guy's name? I don't know his guy's name. I don't really care. It's the Synoptidos. His Synoptidos, his like teacher. What do you call him? Philemon? Philemon, probably. Is that the biblical book? Does anybody know that? I don't know that. Philemon, but Philemon is the New Testament book. Okay. All right. So you have these daemons in the West that are dissimilar from the East because they don't have that. At least that's not they don't worship that. And so in the West, you have that. And Nietzsche's idea was a Christianity, which is an amoral Christianity. That's the hope for Nietzsche. And Jung inherits this. And so he tries to make psychology amoral. He tries to bring in that insight, which I'm attributing to the Christians, and I don't need to do that. I'm just, for historical reasons of my own finitude, that's what I'm doing. And so you have him vis-a-vis Freud and the dream work, bringing into the dream work something more than the sexual impulses. At least this is his way of interpreting Freud. Right? There's sexual conflict in the dream, and it's wish fulfillment and all that. And then Jung's coming along and saying something like there's a return of Christ in the dream. The dream is the return of Christ, is maybe one way to put it very loosely. Okay, so what does this have to do with Emerson? I have no idea. So Jung spins this web, right, of dream interpretation as the Christification of psychology. The subjective method as the Christification of psychology and dream interpretation. And he spins his web in these collected works, and these collected works last a long time. And once you disentangle them, you see he's not saying anything new, except what he's saying is, here is how to be a Christian in the practice of psychology. That's what he's saying. And so when I come to Emerson, my thought is, who was he? He was a writer. He was a writer, I guess. He was a theologian, kind of. He was a speaker, probably. He's a philosopher. And so the question really is, what is his legacy? And I don't know. What I do know is the following. After Emerson, James, dissatisfied, tries to make an empirical argument for the existence of God, and it fails. James's psychology is, nobody reads Jamesian psychology. What do people read James for? He's just a philosopher. What's with these Americans not doing anything? They're just philosophers. It doesn't make any sense. So James tries to prove God and at the same time develop his principles of psychology, which may or may not, I don't actually know, have any influence on psychology. Maybe some stuff, kind of. I mean, the way the unconscious came into America is interesting, because I think ultimately they say, as I alluded to at the beginning of yesterday's video a bit, they have this cognitive behavioral model with Skinner and whatever, conditioning, which all has to do cognitively, and all the people who are trying to control the world, which, more power to you. And then they say, oh, but our cognitions can be biased in ways. And so if you don't call that which biases your cognition unconscious, I'm not quite sure what you call it. They probably call it neurological. And so that maybe is the legacy. If in America we're Freudians because we don't think the unconscious is Christified, there's no Christification of the unconscious according to Jung. If the dreams and the unconscious aren't the return, if the products of the unconscious, which is the transpersonal, aren't second comings, right, in the microcosmic sense. And when I say microcosm, I don't mean it alchemically. I don't mean it that way. I mean it only in the sense that, because I think Christ is called the savior of the microcosm. I don't know. I don't care. I'm tired of alchemy. all I mean in the personal level. So Christ is the savior of the world. He came into macroscopic reality, and I would just parallel that with the macrocosm. The microcosm is the individual. So how is Christ gonna? How am I being uh, Christified? Is it Christified? What is my Christification? Perhaps is the actual way to say it. And the idea would be that James is not yet sufficiently. This is perhaps the idea. Is not sufficient. He is not sufficiently. Jamesian psychology is not. There is yet to be a Christification of Jamesian psychology. That would be the argument. And so, in order to, this is my hope, in order for the Christification of Jamesian psychology, which has to do with all of these ideas of unconscious bias and classification tasks that we talked about yesterday, in order to enact the Christification, perhaps we can look to Emerson. Okay, this is the argument. And the argument I put forward is, first of all I'm trying to say is I'm trying to draw the box around the thing that Emerson is doing. And I talked yesterday, I'm not going to get into it. Maybe I should just argue with Van Leer more. I'm trying to figure out what I'm actually going to say. And maybe I could argue with Van Leer more, but I really don't want to. I think that Emerson was doing ontology, I think should be perfectly clear to anybody. The Jamesian turn is the turn to epistemology. And so the hope would be that we can and you see this with the linguistic turn, all of this stuff. What has the last 100 years done besides make me wealthy? That was a long ass time to get wealthy, dude. That took a long time for America to get wealthy. And it's not yet. America's not wealthy yet. All right. So what have we given up? We've given up the ontology of a religious ontology, which I have not sufficiently explored, although I have gone into some detail into the Puritans. This guy, the Puritan place in, there's a Puritan, I don't know if it's a seminary, but it's a grad school, I think. In Michigan, there's this guy who's just destroying lectures in a positive sense. He's creating a lot of content vis-a-vis the Puritans. So what are the Puritans doing? That's the question. And so I tried to touch on it in the Morgan work, but you can't really get to it. You can and you can't. And so I don't know if I sufficiently addressed the Puritan. But Emerson, I don't know that he's coming out of that. I actually don't know if Emerson is coming out of the Puritans. That could be interesting to look at. But what Emerson is doing is he's trying to legitimately enact the Christification of what does he talk about the most? I mean, he's a philosopher. And he's talking about, okay, so what is my project on Emerson? What did I draw the box around Emerson? I drew the box around Emerson using Dewey. So the way to draw the box around Emerson using Dewey is to look at Dewey's philosophy of science, which is, even in its own time, it's just become so, But the idea is, for Dewey, science is the production of constructs, hypothetical constructs. If you think of a quark, what a quark is just a description of a bundle of effects that are attributed to a common cause that may or may not have a relationship with reality. And it doesn't matter. And that's what Emerson is doing. He's saying, hey guys, here's this thing called God. I'm just going to say it. And this is what God does if you experience God. He creates wisdom and virtue and power and love. And he doesn't go on to say, oh, by the way, God exists. All he says is, I'm naming the virtues God. And that's all he does. And it's not just virtue. Virtue is the easiest one to look at, but the other things to look at are like love. Love is not really a virtue, but it's what are you going to do? So Emerson is just talking about the experience of God. He's talking from the experience of God is probably the most important. And we've lost that. Who talks from the experience of God anymore? We talk about who God is and we define him and we say, hey, there's proof for him. Or we say nothing. But God is in the unconscious. That's the idea. God is in the unconscious. God is the transpersonal. And what is God? Well, this is my secondary argument. Emerson says that. Emerson says that God is. What does he say? He says that. I'm trying to get to the end of this paper. God is the condition of consciousness, so it's Kant's logical I. And who cares about the Germans? We're not talking about the Germans right now. No offense. No offense to the Germans, but I'm not talking about German idealism right now. We're talking about the condition of experience, which is the spirit. And of course, Kant does a really good thing about it, but then he moralizes it, which I don't like. But that's neither here nor there. Okay, so for Emerson, God is a thing that has effects that we talk about in terms of the effects. And he's the condition. He's the condition of the possibility of consciousness. And he goes on to say, other human beings are the condition of consciousness in some way. And so on that line, you just pick out the third thing, which is God is the condition of consciousness for everyone. God is, we might say, the dimension of consciousness is one way to think about it. In the same way that there is forward, backwards, up, down, left, right, time, plus, minus, there's consciousness, up and down, yes and no. There's a dimension of consciousness that flows through time, and that it's a theory. Well, it's not a theory. I don't know what it would be on Steiner, but that's the idea. And so the condition, other people are a microscope into the condition of consciousness. Okay, I have no idea what I'm going to call this video. I don't remember what we were even talking about. How did I start? I don't remember what we were talking about. All right, that's it.